And a warm welcome from my end to all of our panelists and participants as well. Uh, we are living in extraordinary times. The closest analog to the COVID pandemic is perhaps the Spanish flu, which is a century ago. The global economy has not seen a slowdown like this since the Great Depression of 1929, and we are nowhere near the end as yet. In this report, we are going to take stock of what the many disruptions caused by COVID-19 itself, as well as the responses responses to the pandemic, what they mean for air quality management in India. This is obviously rife with uncertainties. We have tried to synthesize using government announcements, academic papers, briefs, indeed many newspaper articles to try and piece this together as the situation is unfolding. The principal intended audience for this report are our colleagues in civil society, our peers, funders, journalists engaged in this issue. We've also extensively cited the work of our colleagues, and we hope that the report for even the general audience provides a good entry point to dive deeper into this work. Our analysis reveals that the disruptions are likely to result in three broad sets of outcomes, each offering a different call to action. New opportunities to accelerate transitions beneficial to environment and health, regressive outcomes in the guise of incentivizing economic recovery that need to be contested, and avenues for sustaining recent progress. And I'll take you through these very quickly over the course of the next few minutes. The first set of outcomes are opportunities to set a new agenda, or those that provide impetus to ongoing efforts. If and when harnessed, these will allow us to lock in infrastructure or accelerate behavioral changes that are well aligned with improved air quality. Household sources. The use of polluting fuels for cooking, for heating, for lighting, form the single largest source of outdoor PM 2.5 exposure in the country, in addition to the enormous health impacts that it has on exposure indoors. The 3 LPG cylinders that were provided to Ujjwala beneficiaries as part of the relief package in March when the lockdown was announced, is consistent with the idea of increased targeted LPG subsidies to the poorest households that could then be sustained as a social protection package that would also have an enormous impact on air pollution mitigation in the country. Stubble burning, as all of us are well aware, in Punjab and Haryana play an important role in the first spike that one sees in pollution levels in the winter in North India between late October to mid-November. There is a second spike that happens subsequently that has nothing to do with stubble burning, which happens at the end of the year. A long-term solution here is transition towards more sustainable cropping choices. During the lockdown and subsequently, uncertainties in labor availability have led to a larger cultivated area for alternatives to paddy. And if the government ensures that these are truly viable for farmers, we may accelerate that transition somewhat. To help revive the auto sector, there has been a call for vehicle scrappage policies. This demand needs to be channeled towards replacing the oldest, dirtiest commercial vehicles that are on the road currently and contribute disproportionately to the air pollution burden. Well, I think what we're doing now is a testament to the point. Large-scale behavioral changes don't happen easily. And now that all of us have been forced to move into this work from home model or rely more and more on online meetings, it's important to sustain this where possible to minimize avoidable use of private transport for work and for meetings. Finally, power plants contribute significantly to the pollution pie, and the consequent health impacts are very well documented. With the financial crisis deepening in the power sector and a significant drop in electricity demand over the last many months, the incentives are perhaps even better aligned now than before the lockdown to retire old polluting plants so that newer, cleaner plants can meet a large fraction of the demand. The second set are regressive outcomes, which need to be firmly contested. Some of these outcomes arise from government efforts to dilute environmental safeguards, formally or informally, while citing the need for urgent economic recovery and improving the ease of doing business. The draft EIA notification, of course, looms large and would have massive implications. It dilutes the process to obtain an environmental clearance. It reduces the categories of projects and activities that will have to undergo impact assessment scrutiny. It curtails public consultation processes significantly and proposes procedures to deal with violations that are legally untenable. These will effectively allow environmental offenses to be condoned at very little or no cost to the violators. I'm sure we are going to discuss this much more during our discussion today. Likewise, there have been unacceptable delays in complying with the power plant emission norms laid down by the MOEFCC back in 2015. A CSE analysis recently suggested that 70% of the coal power plant capacity is unlikely to meet the new extended deadline of 2022 as well. The current crisis cannot become yet another excuse for delays, and these attempts to sort of keep pushing the deadline down the road need to be firmly challenged. The call for increased transparency in monitoring, inspections, enforcement data becomes even more important now, especially when there is this potential risk of informal dilutions in safeguards. It's a crucial tool for communities to be able to hold polluters and regulators more accountable. Those who can afford not to use public transport may increasingly move towards private vehicle use now. It's important. Several measures need to be taken to be able to limit the long-term implications of this. It's important to ensure that public funds, especially those that have been earmarked for air quality, are not directed towards infrastructure like widening roads, building new flyovers, because these only tend to lock in private transport. Finally, there are some areas where there have been steady but significant developments in air quality governance over the last couple of years that need to be sustained. One reason for cautious optimism in my book is that the NCAP and the recently allocated 15th Finance Commission grants linked to air quality have seemingly been unaffected by the fiscal crisis. There is, of course, a need to continue strengthening processes under the National Clean Air Program, updating the list of non-attainment cities, tracking year-on-year progress better, more systematically. The city action plans themselves need a lot of work. But it's important to get on with identifying and implementing the priority actions in parallel with updating the knowledge base. Knowledge gaps exist, certainly, but these should not become an excuse for inaction. Last year, the NCAP process was hobbled by its modest budget. The 15th Finance Commission grants to the 42 large cities for 2020-21 are an order of magnitude higher than the allocations under NCAP last year, and indeed this year as well. And these should help somewhat with this obstacle. However, let's keep in mind that this is a new channel for funds, and much depends on the performance framework that is yet to be finalized by the Central Pollution Control Board and the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. And much also depends on how the state and local governments use these funds. They need to engage with civil society much more than they have so far in developing city action plans under the NCAP. These grants also need to be sustained over the 2021-26 period. This needs to be a long-term effort. Now, to truly see the improvements in air quality levels and make sure that resources are effectively allocated, both NCAP and the Finance Commission grants eventually need to move towards managing air quality at the airshed level. In an encouraging sign, the Environment Minister also signaled recently that this is something that's on their mind and that's a priority for them. But for the researchers in this community, we need to be able to develop the ideas further on how airshed management gets operationalized. Now that the principle has been well acknowledged and so on, we need to be able to also specify what this means in terms of institutionalizing. So the COVID-19 pandemic has appropriately brought about an urgent response given the scale of its effects. Dealing with the pandemic, dealing with getting the economy back on track are critical. But as we set in motion these economic recovery plans now, we must not forget that air pollution that has a long-term mortality and morbidity burden that is significant, that's greater than COVID-19 as per current information. And given India's severe pollution levels, that air pollution is also tackled with a proportionate sense of urgency. This cannot wait till the pandemic is over and behind us. With that, I'd like to conclude. Thanks all of you for joining us again this evening. I now hand it back to Shibani to kickstart the discussion with our panelists. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Santosh, for taking us through the report. Now I'll invite our panelists just for some opening remarks. First, I'll request Dr. Urvashi Narain if she would, kick off the discussion. Basically, we were just hoping you'd tell us, I mean, given that there's so many uncertainties kind of in this world we live in now, and we don't know what the recovery and the post-recovery phases would really look like, what do you think should be our main priorities to sustain and build on the progress that we've made so far on air quality management? And how would you suggest we ensure that we do not lose momentum on the efforts that are already underway?
Thanks, Shibani, and thanks, Santosh. Thanks to both of you for the invitation, but also for this excellent presentation. I really enjoyed reading your report. I think, it's high quality, something I've come to expect from CPR, but also, very informative in this world where the issues are evolving so fast. So I really liked, for example, your emphasis on the multi-sector nature of air pollution. I think sometimes that gets, that understanding is only just evolving. And so this is, very useful to have you lay out all the different sectors that need to be considered in this context. Also, I really liked your emphasis on the airshed, Santosh, which you emphasized during your presentation as well. I think we need to, and Shibani, to answer your question, I think that's where we need to move really is in our understanding of what does it mean for India to manage at the airshed level, because right now the emphasis has been at the city by city level, and India will need to move to a more airshed-based management. Having said that, I also want to say that this report is very timely. I think, Santosh, in your presentation and in the report, you guys draw attention to the health impacts. But I think one thing that we are finding, that the evidence now is growing, that air pollution can actually make COVID-19 health impacts more severe, right? So we're finding that there's 3 mechanisms through which air pollution can have a negative health impact. One is it increases transmission of the virus. And this is largely when there's spikes in air pollution and people cough or sneeze because of air pollution, you will see that that is a transmission mechanism. COVID-19 also makes you, air pollution also makes you more susceptible to the virus because it degrades our immunity, and particularly in the upper airways. And finally, people who are more affected by COVID-19 have the same comorbidities that air pollution increases the risk of. So I think this is this report is very timely because yes, air pollution is a health crisis that we shouldn't lose track of. But the fact is that any effort that governments have to make to reduce the impact and contain the impact of COVID-19 cannot be fully effective if they don't also tackle air pollution at the same time. Now, having said that, obviously, we see the blue skies and the improvements in air quality that you also report. And what we are finding, though, is that as that these are short-lived, right? You very quickly see once a return to economic activity, the air pollution levels are back. And so there is a need, as you say in your report, and I very much concur, that the governments need to stay on track. And this is twofold, right? One is don't dilute environmental regulations. And the second is, stay on track. India has now very expansive efforts to tackle air pollution, both through the NCAP and the 15th Finance Commission air pollution grants. And so there is a need very much to keep those programs on track and to deepen them along the lines that you're suggesting. And then the final point I think I'd like to make is that I very much enjoyed, and I think it's very informative, the kind of opportunities you've identified that have already begun as a consequence of COVID, efforts to contain the virus. But I think where I'd like to see more discussion, and perhaps we can do some of that during this session, is on how some of these efforts can be part of India's economic recovery. Because right now the government is very focused on, and rightly so, on stabilization, right? And it is yet to really put in place a program or to help the economy recover. And what we are at the World Bank trying to suggest and advise countries is that they should embrace green economic recovery, where they can both stimulate the economic activity, which is much needed to bring jobs and restore livelihoods, but also to improve environmental outcomes. So, one thing you point out in your report is the vehicle scrappage policy, right, which could create the demand for better vehicles. But I think if the government is thinking of a sort of a program to incentivize people to buy vehicles, that would also, you need both those in order to really stimulate economic activity. And similarly in the other sectors as well. I mean, there is, for example, we are finding in our work that secondary particle formation, right, is a big contributor to air pollution in India, and that partly is caused by overuse of urea-based fertilizers. And so to the extent that the government reduces subsidies on fertilizers and retargets that subsidy for other economic activity, you can again have both the win of economic activity, but you also can reduce air pollution and so on. And another sector that we should not lose track of is the industry sector, right? And a lot of support is being provided by governments to the MSME sector. And the question is, how can the support allow the sector to move to a greener place? And what kind of policies need to be put in place? So, I'd look forward to further discussion on those. And let me stop. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you so much, Urvashi. That's a really great way to start off the discussion. So Aruna, if I could turn to you and invite you for your comments now. So basically, I mean, the COVID crisis has obviously thrown up some really serious governance issues, whether it's like federalism, state capacity, how nimble is the government to respond to a crisis like this. How do you think the COVID crisis has affected, or in fact will affect, the air quality management efforts that are, have been taken, should be taken? And in fact, if you could also reflect on broader environmental governance in the country, something you've written on, worked on. And also, are you hopeful about India rebuilding better?
Thanks, Shibani. Thank you, Santosh. What an incredible report. It's extremely important at this point to track what's going on. A lot of us have seen these amazing stories of, spotting the Himalayas in cities and clearer skies, and lots of us in the international press and otherwise look to heralding this. Now, unfortunately, everyone has been relegated to my life, which is the life of a freelancer and working from home, which is interesting. But that is an extremely upper class, middle class situation at this point, where we are seeing the impacts, and we got to see it, I think, for the first time many who are chosen to ignore how this country runs, how economic activity runs, who are the people who build our cities, who are the people who feed our cities, clean our cities, how do they live, and seeing millions of migrants on the march in heat waves, in high degrees of extremely polluted cities, being cast out and not thought of. As much as we talk about economic recovery and thinking about reviving that, this is a government that didn't consider its workers and how they would manage to get home or be safe. And if we're going to think about how these policies and how are we going to recover economic activity, I think putting workers, putting citizens, putting public health, and a green recovery. What are the kinds of jobs that we want to generate? How are these also going to be effective in places that are facing multiple crises? So you've got a climate crisis, you've got places that are drought impacted, you've got people who've been displaced, who've come to cities or who've migrated. And these are things that we're not necessarily registering. If this whole attempt to open industrial activity during lockdown without industrial scrutiny, without the kind of environmental scrutiny that industry needs. I'm from Vizag. Right now I'm in Oxford, but I am from a city which is, we've always been confounded saying that, okay, well, you want to say that it's a port city, you want tourism, you want development, but hello, you've got refineries, you've got industries, you've got gas leak, multiple gas leaks. So I've been waking up so many mornings with texts from my friends saying that there's been another leak, or looking at Twitter and wondering how are my parents and grandparents faring, is this close to the city. And I think some of these things are especially kind of making themselves evident, looking at what's happening in Bombay. Reports of a gas leak, no idea where, what. We don't seem to see the kind of how these wider spaces that get ignored, that cities have large industrial ghettos, where also the poor have been pushed, where you have workers working with minimal safety. And of course, while reporting on the Vizag gas leak as well, realizing that and a vast quantum of industries are running without clearances. They're running without permits. No, the Central Pollution Control Board, pollution control boards are so badly staffed, or they haven't bothered. They get auto renewal of consent to establish or operate. That you don't bother to see whether there are basic checks and balances. There have been no environmental studies that have been done, no baseline checks. I think one of the issues, again, of looking at, we have no idea in terms of what comorbidities are, because we don't conduct health impact assessment studies as part of environmental impact. It almost seems like that's like a huge, big dream, big ticket thing to ask for. And then we say no to WHO reports. We say, no, well, we need more indigenous health data, and that's something that we can trust. We don't trust Lancet. But if you're not going to conduct baseline health studies, how do you know what are the degrees of, how are people getting affected? Now, for instance, some of the first victims of those who succumbed to COVID were in Bhopal, were the gas tragedy survivors. And they were having to deal with the fact that existing health infrastructure was being prioritized for COVID, and they weren't able to access. Now, if you're also looking at, we're seeing that cities are cleaner. But I think one of the important parts of the report as well is looking at the thermal power emission standards. We've been talking about this. These were standards which were supposed to kick in 2017 in December. The guidelines were issued in 2015. We're in 2020. And this is, again, we've been letting them off the hook. No penalties. They seem to say that power producers saying that we're broke. They're in front of looking at insolvency proceedings. All of this points to a very clear factor that there is a desperate need for change. Now, saying that power demand has also gone down by 30%, you're already in the middle of an economic slowdown. Add a lockdown to a slowdown, and a lot of things don't make sense. I think one of the other really important things that stems from this is a domestic assessment of how much either coal do we need, how much more polluting industry do we need? And I think some of the things and the areas that we're looking at, we may say that cities are growing cleaner, or because there are not that many cars on the road. What about mining areas and districts? What about areas where there are large clusters of thermal power plants? I wish the representative from Pollution Control Board was here, because many of these are critically polluted industrial areas, which were classified. There was a moratorium on the expansion of new industry, which was declared as part of some of the CPCB studies. In each of these critically polluted clusters, there were no health impact studies conducted. The moratoriums were lifted without explanation. And now we want to add to that pollution load. You want to say, you want to have coal auctions, you want 41 new coal mines in places where there are already trucks running, where you've got fly ash ponds running. And these are the places that are powering India and allowing its economy to go on and be like, you have your digital economy running. It's essentially these lungs that have been sacrificed. And we don't and they're not, many of these places are not on the NCAP. So it's essentially, we're almost saying that Adivasi lives don't matter, Dalit lives don't matter. We don't pay our sanitation or frontline health workers. And yeah, I think I'm hopeful that citizen pressure and what we're seeing right now will actually turn the tide, but I think the government seems to be resisting citizen pressure by the fact that it takes down a website for Fridays for Future that's commenting on the draft EIA notification. So I think the state needs to develop thicker skin and actually listen to people, and not just those in urban areas.
Thanks, Aruna. So many great points made there, and we'll come back to try and unpack some of these things. We also hope that the CPCB member secretary will be joining us very soon. So, these are things that we should explore with him as well. I thought, to sort of begin this discussion, Urvashi, you sort of talked about how it is essential to transition towards airshed management. And you yourself have been playing an important role in advancing this idea. What are a couple of things? Aruna just pointed out right now how there are several places that should, by any definition of the term, be classified as a non-attainment city or a non-attainment region. In some ways, this lens of looking at air quality through this as an urban issue has sort of constrained the management too. So when it comes to airshed management, how do you think are ways that we could operationalize the idea that addresses some of these concerns? And how far away are we from it realistically?
Thanks, Santosh. And Aruna, great points. I hope we can come back to some of those points. Particularly, I liked Aruna's question about, how do we bring jobs in sort of rural areas as part of our green recovery efforts. And I think there's some interesting, the program with the Rural Employment Guarantee Act and extending that to forest areas. I think there's some interesting opportunities there. So I hope we can come back to that. But coming to your question, Santosh, I think, the big, change that we feel is required, and we think Government of India is moving in this direction. And, when Prashant joins us, there is thinking in CPCB on airshed management, right, as well. So we are moving in that direction. I think there needs to be one of the key building blocks is this move away from just by city action planning and efforts to actually nesting these city plans in a state level plan. So you can't just have, and also more generally, we have now done a careful analysis to look at, what actions are required at different levels, just like in the different sectors, just like you have. And if you map out who are the functionaries, who are, what are the policies that are needed, and then who are the functionaries who will actually implement those policies, many of those functionaries are at the state level. They are not at the ULB or city level. So there is a need also for much more coordinated action between the city level and the state level when it comes to implementation. So, so one is, first of all, I think there is a need to also delineate, and you make this point in your report as well. The airsheds of India need to be delineated to understand where the micro airsheds are, around cities, may that be, or larger, across different states. So, where do India's micro and macro airsheds lie? Then there is a need, I think, to shift from the city-by-city planning alone to nesting the city-by-city planning in a state-level action plan. There needs to be coordinated implementation at the ULB level, but also at the state level, because none of the functions. And then I think I'd like to end by saying what I think, Shibani, you've written a lot about as well, is there needs to be much more accountability at the state level. At the moment, I think there's need for some regulatory reform so that there is, right now there is, I think there is no real mechanism to hold states or accountable for not acting, right? Often these issues end up in the courts as in order to force states to act. But I think if the regulations could be strengthened so that there's both the incentive, but also the stick for states to be held accountable. And here, I think the 15 Finance Commission grants will play a very important role. Thanks, Santosh.
Urvashi, could I ask a quick follow-up question to that? After a lot of effort, sort of this NCAP came about and this idea of city-by-city planning emerged. Would the idea of moving to the airshed level while necessary, in some ways sort of signal a little bit of confusion as to how to approach it, or is there a way for it to sort of evolve in an organic way so that it doesn't look like a sort of change direction?
No, I think it's the latter, Santosh. I think you need the city-by-city planning. Once you've identified areas that are out of attainment, you do need to do the planning at the city level as well. So what we're saying is the next transition would be to nest these city-by-city plans in an overall state-level plan, where you also identify some actions that have to be done at the state level. So I think coming to your point about the rural sources, right? I mean, both because there is the impact on rural households just as much as there's impact on urban households, but also there is, and here the thinking is changing, right? I mean, a few years ago, I think the perception was that all air pollution is caused by city level sources or urban sources. And now I think in India, there is much more awareness that rural sources also contribute to air pollution, be it household use of solid fuels, be it agricultural residue burning, be it also, the secondary particle formation. And I think this is where, frankly, the knowledge needs to be further developed, because some of the estimates are showing that as much as 30 to 40% of air pollution is secondary form, right? Which is both NOx and SOx interacting with, say, ammonia from agriculture. So that conversation, I think, and that knowledge base needs to be deepened, and then policy recommendations need to be developed around that. So very much a transition, Santosh.
Great, thank you so much, Urvashi. Aruna, if I could turn to you, you kind of, towards the end of your remarks, you referred to the health impact assessment that's really not part of any of the environmental impact scrutiny that happens, and we don't really have the baseline. But the last few years, I think there was kind of a growing understanding, just kind of that health impacts of air pollution, I think they were getting better understood, at least, relatively. You were part of a photojournalistic project, the Breathless, documenting India's air emergency, that focused on putting a human face to the crisis. So my question to you is, how should the framing of air pollution as a public health emergency, which is what a lot of us working in this area were focusing on, should it change, given that how COVID has come in as the big public health emergency? Does the air pollution as that kind of a framing, does that face, some questions of legitimacy? And how would you suggest we frame air pollution going forward in this kind of post-COVID world?
Thanks, Shibani. I was at the 2017 Conference of Parties on Climate Change, where Arnold Schwarzenegger said, hasta la vista fossil fuels, but also said that air pollution is a way that, and public health is a way that we can talk about climate change, because otherwise to people it seems far removed. It seems much, much further away than we think it is. And I think the framing of this as a public health emergency, or framing this as a public health issue is, and this framing this as a respiratory pandemic is essential. We still don't know all of the impacts or long-term health impacts of COVID, but I think that that framing is something that should stick. Now, Breathless was important because it also, as a project for me, was interesting because we got to travel and try and tell human stories and humanize a crisis of ordinary people fighting extraordinary odds and disease burden to fight for everybody's right to breathe. Now, the idea of a cancer patient in Delhi and his kids refusing to burst crackers on Diwali because knowing that that this is something that affects everyone, that it affects their family individually. So at one level, there is that conversation around individual responsibility, but the idea that they were living in a neighborhood which is extremely lots of construction activity next to many different highways. And these are the things that we somehow seem to miss also as part of it. You've got construction emissions, you've got transport emissions. You're also looking at the fact that, his family went to at least 6 different doctors before figuring out that he had cancer and recovered. But what is that extraordinary toll of having to spend, of having to give up your profession, or having your child run your business while you cope? So that was one city-based thing, but also the other idea of like looking at how point sources differ. Like for instance, we did an essay on Punjab and how we need to transform the agricultural sectors. The farmers were tired of people in Delhi who could not put up with odd even for more than a couple of months, expecting farmers to overhaul their entire agricultural process and stop burning and be penalized for it overnight. Without understanding the kinds of long-term processes that are involved in this. I think the framing of this also needs to change, of looking at drilling down on air pollution and the things that it is connected with, all of these myriad connections. And I think we're seeing that with COVID, it's showing us more than ever how connected we are, that it takes a single pathogen to show us this. Now, for instance, looking at like, the other end of the problem of the fact that, what is happening, and I'm glad Urvashi also brought that out of like point source pollution. You've got secondary particles that come from, you've got NOx and SOx formation of that. So what's happening in your industrial areas, your thermal power generating hubs? Cities are not immune. Raipur, Ranchi, all of the places around these massive centers, and looking at industries around cities. Now, for instance, Chennai has these. One of the stories we did was on a kabaddi coach who was fighting against these big coal ports, and the connection to in Ennore in Chennai on the coast that's extremely industrialized. That these were actually the wetlands that could save Chennai from the flooding. Now, looking at again, I think forming these interconnections, and like the fact that they're fighting against fly ash creeks growing in size, or coal plants. I think what's interesting is to build these complex interconnections, and the fact that we can tell these stories. The framing, of course, is a respiratory pandemic, but also connecting that to climate change, connecting that to the commons, and asking for a cumulative impact assessment in different areas as well, as especially we can start with cities, saying that, okay, how can you have this massive lockdown being lifted, industries restarting? This is a time for us to kind of draw all of that into question of what can we actually sustain, and looking at it long term, like towards local survival. And I think even in our climate things, we look at these faraway things, but we don't consider local pollution and local air pollution as part of the problem. We keep saying historic responsibility, but the current burden that some communities more than most face, and we'll only get to see that play out. So yeah, respiratory pandemic is a good way to frame it, and that rehauling this infrastructure, or tightening environmental governance, decentralizing, and for cities and states to assume more power, not of course in the way that the central government envisions it, saying we will put all of these in B2 categories of industry so that states can put a tick mark against it, no scrutiny, restart, but in the sense of how people kind of form those priorities. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I think it's a mouthful, respiratory pandemic, but it has a ring to it. I hope advocacy folks catch on to it, and let's see. Okay. So Urvashi, in fact, I'm going to we had a question for you, but we also have a question from the audience, which I'm going to combine here because I think it's relevant. You already kind of touched on green recovery, and that's kind of the path to take going forward. And that's something the World Bank, of course, has been arguing for, the green stimulus packages. So we're wondering if you could talk about it a little more. So, I mean, how feasible or probable is it that goals of environmental friendly economic recovery are likely actually to be achieved in India? And more specifically, and this question comes from Olena Banerjee, and she's talked because, in fact, even you mentioned MSME sector in your opening remarks. So it'd be interesting to know how that particular sector and its revival could be made more green, if you had some comments on that. And are there any particular types of MSMEs that you think would be targeted? And finally, are there components of green recovery that India should prioritize? I mean, of course, you did speak about airshed level management being something as important part of air quality management, but more generally on green recovery.
Thanks, Shibani. So let me pick up on something that Aruna said also, right? I mean, as part of this green recovery, yes, we need to think about how you can stimulate economic activity while improving environmental outcomes. But I think there is an opportunity to do this also in India's rural areas, right? I mean, there has been, and the government has put a lot of resources, has made resources available, for example, for rural employment guarantee schemes. And typically these have not been implemented in India's forest areas, but now there's an effort to open that. And, we have examples from, almost a century ago in the US during the Great Depression. There was a very successful program called the Civilian Conservation Corps, under which they invested in their public lands, in their protected, in their parks, which is equivalent to their protected areas, and their forests. And a lot of tree plantation happened, soil prevention of soil erosion happened. But this is also the scheme under which the US invested in all the infrastructure for its parks, right, which gave which now today is the basis of the very thriving nature-based tourism sector in the US, which brings benefits not just to the national economy, but very much to the local economy. So now there's figures to show that every year the US government invests $3 billion in its parks, in its national parks, and that generates actually $24 billion worth of economic return for the local communities. So you can create jobs now, and you can also lay the foundation of an economic sector for the future. And so this is where, the resources that are being made available, for example, for rural employment and to invest in India's forests, if they are, designed in a way so that you're creating jobs now, which is very much needed to support rural livelihoods and to, for especially for the households, the more vulnerable households in rural areas. But then you can use that as a basis to create a thriving tourism sector, which will be needed in the future, right? So that is a good example of a green recovery or green stimulus program. So that's more in rural areas. Now, coming to your question about MSMEs, that is also possible, right? For as government is giving, sort of support to the MSME sectors, there's credit guarantees being given, for example. Now, if you have, you give additional guarantees for industries that decide to sort of improve their environmental performance, that is one aspect. But I think at the same time, because India has, for example, the Z scheme already, right? The zero effect, zero defect scheme. Now, in order for that to really go to scale, you also need, green procurement scheme, where you actually incentivize and you create demand for green products. And, given the scale of the country, given the scale of the government, if there is more emphasis on green procurement, then you're at the one side creating demand for the green industry, and the other side, you're supporting that industry to become greener. So both the demand and supply side efforts are needed to really take the industry to the next level. So I think it is possible, but there needs to be a focus both on rural areas as well as urban areas. And similarly, there's possibilities in the transport sector, which I think you talk about in your report as well, and we've discussed briefly. Let me stop.
Thank you. So Aruna, just going back to kind of the highly polluted areas and the clusters that you talked about, and you mentioned the CEPI index, and of course the vulnerable affected communities there. I thought we'd take the discussion more towards environmental regulation and the threat of dilution that is looming large. We've mentioned in our report the draft EI notification, which we think significantly dilutes the process. And of course, there are other ways in which the government might decide to dilute various regulatory procedures. What would you share that assessment? What are your views on this? What do you think are the kind of the significant developments in the last few months, or even in the recent past, that you think are real cause for concern, given the state we are in now?
Yeah, I think there might be a little laughter and the sound of ambulance sirens in the background, but I think that adds a nice dystopian effect. But it's something that's kept me up at night for the last at least 6 years. Not the laughter and the sound of sirens, but definitely the sound of sirens when we're talking about deregulation of environmental standards. There would be points of time in 2014 where I would wake up in a cold sweat, imagining that a certain law would be diluted, and go to the ministry website and see that amendment had actually been passed. On New Year's Eve, wondering whether the Land Acquisition Act amendments had been passed or not, and then waking up on New Year's Day and be like, yes, okay, ordinance, right? So I think so much of this is we're seeing this now, and we've seen the rapid dilution, which is of course the draft EIA notification. It is a dilution of an act which was anyway a dilution of a previous iteration. So we're talking about, and we're also looking at an act which, as much as I feel maternal towards, or somehow some form of kinship as having referred to its various sections over and over again, that it's something that's extremely poorly enforced in the first place. We are fighting to save safeguards which are already poorly enforced, and systems which don't work. We talk about public hearings, knowing how these things actually occur when they are populated by outsiders, they're rigged by companies, as specific editing studios that edit out dissent, when these things were actually happening. But now to say that we don't want them at all, I think it's over the years been is an attempt to people from the conversation. We have seen public hearings being removed for a wide sector of industries especially from coal mining expansions to oil and gas exploration, looking at construction, now saying the pharmaceutical industries. Everybody gets a free pass. And as much as we say that this is a government that loves to communicate, it's very, very, very one way. Now, even the government had said that it was opposed to the World Bank's safeguards on free, prior, informed consent of indigenous communities back in 2015. Now, we're seeing ways and means in which the Forest Rights Act itself also being under threat over this period of time, much as this is a sector where we're talking about airsheds and the last grand tracts of forest. Now, it has also been accompanied by, especially talking about the access to remedy. One of the cases that we documented in Breathless as part of our project was the fact that the National Green Tribunal was video conferencing much before COVID, because the government has failed to appoint expert members and judges, and regional benches got shut down. So we're saying Atmanirbharta, looking at self-reliance in different regions, or the fact that communities can access courts and access justice. Now, the fact that they've had to video conference with judges even before COVID and hope to seek remedy, where and travel all the way to Bhopal, Skype with the judge, maybe not. So I think we've seen the erosion of courts and erosion of justice, where cases are pending for months. The Supreme Court will stay something, and then you have regional benches not functioning. So we allow the lack of accountability to go on, I think. And of course, pollution control boards try and do their jobs. They file show cause notices, and those cases linger in district courts forever. So I think we need an overhaul of what justice will look like. What are the kinds of accountability that we're looking for? You put a 200 crore fine on a Sterlite copper, and what? Or you impose a fine on an industry, and do you allow it to continue? Are you empowering pollution control boards to take the kind of action that they need to? Are violators, do we trust them to self-regulate in good faith when again, we're looking at the Bagjan fires in Assam still burning while there's a flood going on in the state. So we're seeing like these multiple factors combining. Now, if the government is to take it seriously, or if looking at what environmental justice it is in the country, then that's something that's that I fear is under serious threat. And groups that have dared to criticize it, human rights defenders who have dared to challenge it, are facing threats. They're having their licenses or access to funding cancelled, and these are extremely disturbing things at this point of time. Now, if we were to listen to its citizens, if we were to look at the kinds of safeguards that are in place, and seeing how other cities and other parts of the world are right now, for instance, taking their governments to court for violating, both in terms of environmental norms, I think there's a lot more to be seen on what can be done. I think, but it's still something that it keeps us up at night, because then you wonder where can citizens access justice if you can't raise your voices, you can't file complaints on a website, can't approach a court. So it almost becomes something that licenses, you want to do away with any public opposition. So start a Central Vista project when you should actually be expanding public spaces and greener spaces in a city. So challenges.
Yeah. So I wonder if I could pick up a couple of themes here, and there are also lots of great questions that are pouring in. Urvashi, Aruna just spoke about the accountability of regulators. You have new instruments such as the Finance Commission grants that are opening up now. So in some ways, we recognize that tackling air pollution requires this multi-pronged approach, different types of instruments with different types of agencies. So in terms of improving accountability on the one hand of the pollution control boards to citizens, and making these agencies more approachable, and to sort of facilitate this cross-agency coordination, presumably with the pollution control boards playing this central role, as would be required for certainly city action plans under NCAP, but also the Finance Commission grants. What is what's an appropriate way to think about regulation going forward, especially next couple of years in terms of air quality governance? What are the main sort of reform measures do you think we should be doing for better accountability and better cross-actor coordination? And how do these new grants and so on play a role?
Thanks, Santosh. I'd like to pick up on this issue of accountability. And I think accountability, I think what we are seeing in India, and we've seen, right? I mean, you have a case in India of where Delhi in the late 1990s made a remarkable change, right? I mean, nowhere in the world have we seen over such a short period of time, just 2 years, a complete switch over of from diesel or petrol vehicles to CNG, right? I mean, so there is remarkable change is possible, and civil society played a very important role in that, as Aruna is pointing to. Now, where are we today? So we have seen in the meantime a number of cities have developed action plans. Of course, this is being done under the NCAP, but even prior to the NCAP, right? Supreme Court has asked for action plans to be developed in the past, perhaps following what was happening in Delhi. Now, we didn't see a lot of implementation of those plans. And so the question is, how do you both incentivize the implementation, but also how do you hold states more accountable? So coming to your question, your issue, the issue you raised about the 15th Finance Commission, we see this as a very, very important move, right? Very rarely have countries made such large amounts of money available and tied for air pollution management. But in order for the 15th Finance Commission grants really to be effective, there needs to be, first of all, better monitoring of air quality, better measurement, better attribution of when a policy actually brings about change in air quality. And if this kind of monitoring and evaluation system, Santosh, is both put in place, but then made publicly accessible, right? If the data is more accessible, if the evaluation of policies is more open, that will create more transparency, it will create more accountability as well. Right? So there's a big link between this creating this incentive for action, but also the creating more accountability. And I think under the 15th Finance Commission, it is possible for them to consider both process-based metrics as well as performance-based metrics, which are based on air quality improvement. So if the 15th Finance Commission institutionalizes efforts whereby monitoring networks are established, as well as the data is made available, you will get better accountability. So I think that is important. That's one. Second, I think there is a need for, and you talked about this because of the need for, coordinating across sectors. The transport sector has to play a role, the power sector has to play a role, the industry sector has to play a role. And there is a need to coordinate the efforts of these sectors. Now, pollution control boards can provide planning support and they can provide technical advice. But I think this kind of coordination needs to sit with the executive authority in state. So perhaps a high-level committee headed by the chief secretary that would coordinate this effort would be required. And again, something like this can be institutionalized as part of the 15th Finance Commission grants as well. And the final point I'd like to make, Santosh, is I think there is a need to rethink what kind of authority or accountability is created through our regulations, say the Environment Protection Act or the Air Act at the moment, right? What we have seen in other countries and international experience, for example, let me give you the example of the US. there is a very similar process in the US of managing air, where cities are required to produce action plans. Now, those action plans are nested within a state implementation plan, so the state is held accountable. Now, how is the state held accountable? The state is, first of all, required to produce these state action plans. If the state does not produce the action plans, or if the implementation of the action plan doesn't take place in a timely manner, the US EPA can withhold funds, federal funds for transportation, right? So that is a big sort of a stick that the US government has, or the US EPA has. This is before anything moves into the realm of the courts, right? So you have within the regulatory functions and within the executive, you have fairly strong instruments that will bring accountability. So I think there is a need in India as well to, I think the courts have played a fantastic role, and they will continue to play an important role, but they can't be the only sort of regulatory authority holding people accountable. The legislations, the laws need to be strengthened so that there is more accountability created amongst regulators as well as the executive branches.
Aruna, if I could turn to you. So I'm kind of combining a few questions we've got from the audience, and I think some things that I also want to ask. So Jyoti's question is, what are the 3 concrete and most effective things civil society can do or get done to ensure that the government chooses a green path to recovery? So I mean, a question to you basically, given that you've seen many civil society movements and interacted with a lot of members of the civil society, how would you kind of prioritize demands for green recovery in the post-COVID phase? How do you think we should move on that? Secondly, the problem of air pollution is often seen distinct from climate change in India, even though there is obviously, co-benefits are very, very clear. And do you have any suggestions as to how these 2 areas, even institutionally, could speak to each other? Or in civil society or in the advocacy community or in the media, how these 2 issues, which are clearly interlinked, be brought closer together?
Okay, so I'm going to look at the civil society bit, which is Jyoti's question. I think looking at different movements and what has worked, one extremely effective movement that sprung up, also because of its location, was the RA movement and in Mumbai to save the RA forest. Of course, many trees were hacked, damage was already done, but to see a coalition of people in cities, whether it's bankers with working or fighting or raising awareness alongside Adivasi communities who live there, creating a greater awareness of the commons and being able to push and put pressure on political leaders as well as parties to take decisions that work for the city, to say that, okay, for instance, that this is the city, these are the city's lungs, and a greater awareness of what that is, because as somebody who lived in Bombay for 12 years, I mean, you're united by the traffic, the hustle, and you kind of forget that there's air and water as part of that equation. Now, to see the sort of concerted cooperation that happened, as well as communication between various different sectors of one that had many different powerful actors that came forward, was a watershed movement. Looking at, for instance, so there's that in terms of people in cities, as well as building coalitions with forest movements in the country's hinterlands, and working together to bring about greater pressure on actors as well as on the opposition. Now, I think that's something now, if citizens can prioritize these existential questions of air, water, climate change, how are we going to survive? instead of politicians kind of take advantage of the fact of skewing the on the basis of religion as well as caste
Aruna, I
lines,
think we lost you.
and make these the kinds of measures that can be exerted. Sorry, can you hear me? Yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
I think
there was
we
maybe
lost
like
for
a
second.
minute or so where I think the signal was bad. So if you could, I know it's difficult, but if you could rewind a little bit. Yeah.
Okay, just to rewind, I think building stronger alliances between city and countryside, pressuring politicians to address these existential questions of, do we really need infrastructure that's not really called for? Do we need climate resilient infrastructure? We need better air quality, and not just a greater network of monitors, because monitors will tell you, you can put them in different parts of the city or different parts of an area. They'll give you data, but aside from just data, some of this is just common sense. Do you need to destroy a set of mangroves, or do you need flood defenses for when climate change comes there? Do you need forests to help you breathe better? So I think making those connections, exerting, refusing to be distracted along these usual issues that politicians use to divide people, and instead looking at what unites us, which is air, water, and the threat of climate change. Being something that's really important. I think in the climate debates, what often gets lost is, and this is something that, of course, that I receive some amount of just critique for, but I don't think it's defensible when we continue to look at, we can keep talking about historical responsibility and think that's important, and looking at what developed countries versus developing countries and their emissions. But I think the fact is that we are facing these impacts in real time, that looking at air pollution plus heat, it's going to be impossible to have to sustain the kind of industrial activity, or if you can't work, if you can't breathe, if cities are getting hotter, if there's drought in so many areas, how do you address that plus pollution? So I think looking at the localized impacts of air pollution as well as our energy choices or our transportation choices becomes extremely important, and that those things need to, as much as we might go on the historical responsibility route, I think addressing our current circumstances and the millions of people who are at risk right now is something that needs to emerge. And otherwise, we're sacrificing the poor on basis of arguments which are just. But if we have to kickstart the transition, it has to happen here in the parts of the world that are most affected.
Thanks, Aruna. So we have Mr. Shashikant Shinde has asked us a question here, saying, is it possible to improve air pollution? Is it possible to control pollution without lockdown? And I wonder if I could take off from that question. Urvashi, what do you think is the appropriate way to sort of draw lessons from the lockdowns improvements in air quality? We know that there were blue skies, but there is this risk of interpreting that to mean that, look, if we want to get that kind of a blue sky back, we should be closing down activities of various kinds, right? So what's a reasonable way of drawing those lessons on those blue skies during the lockdown without sort of playing into this environment versus economic growth type trade-off?
Yeah, a great question. I think we need to recognize, this improvement in air quality has come at immense human suffering, and this is not the kind of cost we want to pay for improved air quality, right? I mean, Aruna referred to this when she talked as well, and there's, there's kind of loss of livelihoods for the most vulnerable. I mean, this is not an acceptable cost for bringing improvement in air quality. But it is possible. And in fact, Santosh, this is where I think I'd like to point to the need for better data. And, India is establishing, expanding its network of continuous air quality ambient monitoring stations. And we need to see this happen faster and at a wider scale. And, we are starting to analyze this data. And what we're seeing is a steady decline between 2018, 2019, and 2020 across the country for the most harmful of pollutants, right? PM 2.5. Then, of course, one doesn't quite know yet what has caused this improvement in air quality between 2018 and 2020. Which government policies have been important for this? But the importance of data, having good data to both track and then to inform planning is very important. And here it is possible. There is, efforts in every sector. You talked in your report about the strict emission standards that have been brought in for the power sector. Those need to be implemented. Now, there are ways of implementing that to reduce the cost imposed. So, for example, in the US, there was, very effective program of SO2 trading, which also reduced the emissions from the power sector, but at a fraction of the cost of a more command and control system. So better policies to reduce the cost of pollution management is important, right? You can find examples across almost every sector where it is possible through good policy design to improve air quality, to stimulate economic demand, and recover the economy without imposing such large costs on rural livelihoods, on the livelihoods of the most vulnerable. And I'd like to just end by saying, Santosh, our analysis is showing that even though NOx has reduced and dramatic, we find across, these incredible satellite images are showing before the lockdown, and after the lockdown, NOx emissions have completely disappeared. And that is understandable because NOx is largely generated by transport. But we are not seeing as dramatic declines in PM 2.5, right? We've looked at the data for Kolkata, for example. You actually don't see any decline in PM 2.5 despite the lockdown, and some decline comes only 3 weeks after the lockdown happened. So, it's a much more complex source structure of pollution, and particularly of PM 2.5. So you can't just down economic activity and expect air quality of the most harmful pollutant will improve. And in any case, that's not the cost that society can pay for improving air quality. Better monitoring, better efforts to understand the sources of pollution, and then using that to inform policy, to make policy that incentivizes compliance and doesn't just require or regular, enforcement. And so looking at market-based instruments beyond command and control, finding more effective ways of designing policies, of implementing them, I think is the way to go, Santosh.
May I ask a follow-up, Urvashi? And Aruna, we'll circle back to the same question with you. With market-based instruments, there's certainly a lot of literature sort of talks about the increased efficiency of such instruments and so on. But as you're well aware, one of the challenges that we keep running into is very limited state capacity to sort of implement fairly more blunt instruments. Given that there is a certain inelasticity of this question on capacity, in a sense that it's not just about, it will take a while, is my sense, for our pollution control boards to be able to deploy these sort of more nuanced instruments. What would sort of the trajectory be? And Aruna, later for you, the question is, would you, from what you have seen, what do you think would be the feasibility of these approaches in India? But first, Urvashi.
Thanks, Santosh. Santosh, I'm not sure I would put it in those terms. I think there is capacity in India. I mean, you see some amazing policies. You have the PAT scheme already in India being implemented, right? The Perform, Achieve, and Trade scheme for energy efficiency. Now, that is a fairly large scheme, and of course, more can be done to make that scheme more effective. But you do have a fairly large emissions trading scheme already, energy efficiency trading scheme already in the works in India. And we're seeing, very successful implementation of a trading scheme coming out of Gujarat. And so, Santosh, I'm not sure I think it's time to move towards more, the access to data and including, improvement data. If you have better SEMS data, right, the continuous emissions monitoring data is what will be required in order to really form the foundation of market-based instruments. And so I think putting the efforts in improving the quality of data and improving the access to data and then designing schemes that rely more on market-based instruments, I think while creating accountability and transparency, so civil society also has an important role and to play. I think that is feasible in the India of today, Santosh.
Aruna?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we did have a very interesting or very useful mechanism known as the National Clean Energy Fund, which was based on a carbon tax on every ton of coal produced as well as imported. And the fact that this was meant for research and development in renewables, that this was something which others could access, which startups could, whether they were kind of looking at batteries or storage, or also this was sort of meant to be our adaptation budget as well. We've also got, of course, has been diverted to India's GST compensation fund, but that's a sort of fund that kind of needs to be claimed back, because also looking at the District Mineral Foundation and the funds which have been accumulated under that. Now, if you were to see greater civil society as well as citizen participation in how those vast sums of money are being spent. Now, we are saying that this is going to be used to aid COVID health infrastructures, or states can use that at their discretion. What if citizens as well as other players could propose different projects to actually reduce this or deal with pollution control or set that up? I think the emphasis on data is interesting, because I'm both divided, because if I'm like, we look at it, states, mineral bearing states, a lot of different industries, polluting industries, don't release their data. Or they don't have continuous air quality monitors. I think many of them didn't even have a single one. Odisha, Chhattisgarh, and Jharkhand had maybe one or two or reporting data, whereas you have a city like Delhi that has over 30. Now, looking at data disparities of what do we choose to report, where do we choose to report, all of that is extremely important. So I'm saying that if you're going to put an emphasis on data, let's have this coming from regions where the state doesn't want us to look. And if that is the case, what are the kinds of both penalties and otherwise it can be kind of put in there? I think it's important to look at how the investment community has been playing a role. Now, you've been seeing insurers as well as investors, sovereign wealth funds playing a greater role and maybe stepping away from more polluting industries, or saying that we won't finance impactful, like looking at coal projects, where the divestment movement has been picking up in different parts of the world, which and also from looking at the market playing a role where transitioning to different forms of energy are actually cheaper. Now, I think at this point, assuming that market forces are going to play a greater role, especially now looking at whether the oil industry has been hit, looking coal being hit. Who's going to have the money to back polluting projects, even if they are served up on a platter by the government? So I think right now, much as there is, I have both skepticism. I think it's interesting times that we live in and will call for an overhaul. Now, instead of bailing them out by using public funds such as the Power Finance Corporation to bail out or set up more polluting industries, or set up a power plant that's emitting or that exporting coal to Bangladesh, coal power. So I think looking at that, revising that, stopping the use of public money and funds to support activities that don't let us breathe, and considering, how do we invest, what do we invest in, and I think it plays a greater role of and I think we as taxpayers and citizens, and looking at those mechanisms that are available to us and where we choose to put our money, and exercising that will, and that's going to matter a lot in terms of how we recover.
Thanks, Aruna. I think we're now running out of time, and unfortunately, the member secretary seems to have been held up in this meeting. But I think it's just enough time for one last question in closing now. And so Professor Agnik Day asks, and Urvashi, perhaps you can take this. Without an adequate ground-based reference grade measurement representing regional airships, how could we engage alternative methods, satellite-based satellite data and modeling-based estimates, low-cost sensors, etc., in our current jurisdiction framework to assess accountability? And knowing what we do in terms of this preference for the official method, what could this trajectory look like?
Thanks, Santosh, and thanks, Sagnik, for that question. I think Sagnik's work here is really important, and I think we've been talking about sort of at some level, because of the economic crisis, one has to find cost-effective and ways of doing things in this new world. And I think there's a huge opportunity in moving to combining different sources of data and different technologies, right? So combining ground level monitoring, which is needed to anchor the data, but also for regulatory purposes. But you can have a less dense ground level monitoring network if you combine it with low-cost sensors as well as with satellite data. And Sagnik's work is showing how satellite data can actually now, with some ground truthing, give you actually very useful and give you much wider coverage, right? You will always have the ground level monitors just in a few locations, while satellite data can give you the coverage for the entire country. It can help identify hotspots where you may not have ground level monitors because you didn't think there was a pollution problem. So I think absolutely, I completely agree with Sagnik on this, that there is a need for us to keep experimenting. At the moment, I think the satellite data and ground level data sort of combination has come very far. But there is still a need to improve the efficacy of low-cost monitors and the technology so that it can also similarly be combined. But I'm sure that can be, in the coming years, we will see more reliability of low-cost sensors so that these can be combined. So, very much agree. And this is where there's a huge opportunity to reduce costs, but to make, monitoring much more effective.
Well, thank you so much, Urvashi and Aruna, for today's participating in today's panel, and to everyone else who was with us today during the webinar. Sorry, Dr. Prashant Gargava could not join us. We also had a bunch of questions for him, and we would have really liked if he could have responded to those. So really sorry for that. We do hope all of you will be able to engage with our report. We look forward to feedback from you. But it's quite clear from today's discussion and from what we read around, clearly the path forward has to be something where the environmental safeguards are not diluted. It's something that's certainly kept in mind, that ease of doing business is not prioritized, though we understand it's an important thing, but we think it's an either or situation. And it's important to keep in mind, as Aruna said, how we invest, where we invest, what kind of jobs are we generating, and where are those jobs that are coming up. I do think the work that Urvashi and all are doing on airshed management is becoming more and more important to ensure that city level action plans, while important, are not the only focus of our air quality management going forward, and certainly include other areas which are critically polluted and certainly require our urgent attention to be very much part of the air quality management efforts going forward, more so now in the post-pandemic world, where as and when we enter that post-pandemic world than ever before. So thank you so much. I'll end the webinar here and hope to look forward to kind of engaging with all of you in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you, Shibani, and thank you, Santosh.
Thank you, Urvashi. Thank you,
Thank you.
Shibani. Thank you. And for everyone listening. Is it just us now?
No, not yet.
Amazing. Okay, good. I missed the CPCB in this discussion.
Sharon, could you end the meeting?